The commander's bullet tore through her thigh. And as Lieutenant Casey Viper Reeves collapsed onto the cold concrete floor of the training facility, something deadly awakened behind her eyes, something that would teach everyone present that Navy SEALs fight better when angry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Blood pooled beneath her leg as she lay motionless on the gray concrete, her breathing controlled despite the searing pain. The training simulation had gone horribly wrong. What was supposed to be a routine hostage rescue exercise had turned into a nightmare when Commander James Titan Kelloway's weapon misfired during the breach, the round finding flesh instead of the foam target just inches away. The crack of the gunshot still echoed off the walls of Building C, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. The training facility at Naval Station Meridian Bay was a symphony of controlled chaos every Tuesday morning. The echo of combat boots on concrete mixed with the rhythmic pounding of heavy bags and the sharp crack of simulated gunfire from the tactical range. Steam rose from the outdoor obstacle course where recruits crawled through mud under razor wire, their instructors barking commands that could be heard 3 buildings away. Inside Building C, the main training hall buzzed with the energy of elite warriors honing their craft. Fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the rubber mats where SEAL candidates practiced close-quarters combat, their movements precise and deadly. The air smelled of sweat, gun oil, and the metallic tang of adrenaline that never quite left a place where people trained to survive the impossible dot at 0900 hours sharp. Just as it had for the past 6 months, Team Bravo gathered around the equipment lockers on the facility's east side. These weren't fresh-faced recruits struggling through Hell Week. These were seasoned operators, men who'd seen action in 3 different theaters and carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from walking through fire and emerging intact. Staff Sergeant Ryan Hawk Thompson leaned against his locker, adjusting the straps on his tactical vest while regaling his teammates with stories from their recent operation in the Hindu Kush. His voice carried the easy authority of someone who'd led men through situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Around him, the others checked their gear with the methodical precision of professionals who knew that attention to detail wasn't just important, it was survival. Petty Officer First Class Derek Bullseye Walsh cleaned his sidearm for the 3rd time that morning, a nervous habit he'd developed after a close call in Kandahar, where a jammed weapon nearly cost him his life. Beside him, Chief Petty Officer Mike Ironside Rodriguez rapped his knuckles with practiced efficiency, the scars on his hands telling stories of a dozen different firefights across 2 different continents. The rhythm of their morning routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Equipment check, briefing, tactical drills, live-fire exercises, and then the afternoon combat simulations that pushed them to their limits and sometimes beyond. It was a world where weakness wasn't just discouraged, it was potentially fatal. Not just for you, but for the brothers who depended on you. When the bullets started flying for real, the facility itself reflected this unforgiving reality. Every surface was designed for function over form. Concrete walls painted in military gray, reinforced doors that could withstand explosive breaches, and training equipment that had been tested in every environment from Arctic tundra to desert sandstorms. This wasn't a place for comfort or sympathy, it was a forge where ordinary soldiers were hammered into something extraordinary. And only the strongest metal survived the process. Outside the reinforced windows, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, its surface deceptively calm in the morning light. Ships moved in and out of the harbor with clockwork precision, each one carrying its own cargo of warriors heading toward conflicts most civilians would never hear about on the evening news. The sight served as a constant reminder of why they were here, somewhere out there. Their skills would be tested in circumstances where failure wasn't just a training exercise grade, but a body count. The wall-mounted speakers crackled to life with the voice of Commander Patricia Steele Harrison, the base's training coordinator and a legend in her own right. Her announcements were always brief, professional, and delivered with the kind of authority that made even veteran SEALs straighten their posture instinctively. Today would be no different, except for one crucial detail none of them could have anticipated. The morning air carried the distant sound of helicopters, conducting training flights over the nearby mountain range, their rotors beating a familiar rhythm that every operator knew by heart. It was the sound of extraction, of salvation, of hope when everything else had gone sideways. But sometimes, even the helicopters couldn't reach you in time. Sometimes you had to fight your way out with whatever you had left. Regardless of what the enemy had taken from you, Team Bravo had trained for every conceivable scenario: hostage rescue, urban warfare, deep reconnaissance, direct action missions that required them to strike fast and disappear faster. They'd practiced fighting while wounded, while exhausted, while outnumbered and outgunned. But none of their training had prepared them for what they were about to witness, or for the lesson they were about to learn about what happened when you pushed certain people too far. The clock on the wall ticked toward 0915, marking time with the same relentless precision that governed everything in their world. In 15 minutes, their perception of strength, determination, and what it meant to be a warrior would be forever changed by someone whose quiet presence had been hiding capabilities that none of them could have imagined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The men of Team Bravo weren't just any collection of military personnel thrown together by chance. They were a brotherhood forged in the crucible of special operations, each one handpicked for skills that had been proven under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Their reputation preceded them wherever they went, whispered about in the corridors of the Pentagon and spoken of with reverence and forward. Operating bases from Afghanistan to Syria, Ryan Hawk Thompson had earned his nickname during a 3-day reconnaissance mission in the mountains of Pakistan, where his ability to spot enemy movement from impossible distances had saved his entire squad from walking into an ambush. At 32, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd been tested by fire and emerged stronger. His tactical vest bore the subtle marks of previous deployments: a small tear from shrapnel in Fallujah, a discolored patch where blood had soaked through during a firefight in Mosul. When Hawk spoke, others listened, not because of his rank, but because his judgment had kept men alive when conventional wisdom would have gotten them killed. Derek Bullseye Walsh had acquired his moniker the hard way, earning it one shot at a time during urban combat operations where millimeter precision meant the difference between neutralizing a threat and creating collateral damage. His service record read like a greatest hits compilation of modern warfare: Ramadi, Tikrit, Helmand Province, each location marking another successful mission where his marksmanship had turned the tide. At 29, he possessed the kind of steady hands and unwavering focus that made him invaluable during hostage rescue operations, where a single shot had to count and there were no second chances. Chief Petty Officer Mike Ironside Rodriguez was the team's close-quarters combat specialist, a man whose reputation for surviving hand-to-hand encounters had become the stuff of legend among special operations communities. The scars on his knuckles told stories of fights in abandoned buildings, where rifles became useless and survival came down to who wanted to live more. His record included 3 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, though he rarely spoke about the circumstances that had earned them. What mattered to his teammates wasn't the decorations on his dress uniform, but the fact that when things went sideways and the situation devolved into chaos, Ironside always found a way to bring everyone home. These weren't men who impressed easily or respected authority simply because it existed on paper. They'd served under officers who cracked under pressure and alongside operators who talked a better game than they played. They'd learned to judge people not by their words or their rank insignia, but by their actions when bullets started flying and adrenaline took over rational thought. In their world, respect was earned in moments when character was tested beyond normal human limits, and it was lost just as quickly when someone's true nature revealed itself under pressure. The team had been together for 18 months, long enough to develop the kind of intuitive communication that made them devastatingly effective in combat situations. They could read each other's body language across a crowded room, anticipate each other's movements during complex tactical maneuvers, and provide covering fire based on nothing more than a glance or a subtle hand signal. This wasn't just teamwork, it was a form of brotherhood that transcended normal military relationships and created bonds that would last long after their service ended. Their success rate on missions was exceptional, even by special operations standards. They'd completed 17 consecutive operations without a single friendly casualty, a record that had earned them recognition at the highest levels of military command. More importantly, it had earned them the kind of confidence that came from knowing they could handle whatever the enemy threw at them. Regardless of how desperate or dangerous the situation became. In the hierarchy of Naval Station Meridian Bay, Team Bravo occupied a unique position. They were respected by instructors, envied by junior personnel, and given the kind of operational freedom that came with proven results. When they walked through the facility, conversations paused and attention shifted their direction, not out of fear, but out of genuine admiration for what they'd accomplished and what they represented. This morning was no different. They owned their space in Building C the way apex predators owned their territory, completely and without question. The equipment lockers, the tactical preparation area, even the way they moved through the facility spoke of men who belonged at the top of their profession's food chain. They'd earned their place through sacrifice, skill, and the kind of dedication that most people couldn't comprehend, let alone match. But for all their experience and proven capability, they were about to encounter something that would challenge their understanding of what it meant to be elite. They were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous warriors were the ones who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, the ones who carried their credentials not in their service records, but in scars that told stories too, classified for official documentation. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor outside Building C. But these weren't the heavy, purposeful strides that usually announced the arrival of another SEAL team or training instructor. These steps were different, lighter, more measured, carrying a rhythm that suggested someone moving with deliberate care rather than military urgency. The steel door leading into the main training hall opened with its familiar metallic groan, and the figure who entered immediately shifted the atmosphere of the room in ways that nobody could quite articulate. Lieutenant Casey Viper. Reeves stepped through the doorway with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of someone completely comfortable in their own skin, regardless of the environment. She was average height, perhaps 5'7", with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that revealed sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to take in everything without appearing to stare. Her BDU uniform was standard issue, properly pressed and maintained, but somehow it hung on her frame in a way that suggested functionality over appearance, the clothing of someone who viewed their gear as tools rather than symbols. What struck the members of Team Bravo wasn't her gender. They'd worked alongside female operators before and had learned to judge people by their capabilities rather than their chromosomes. What caught their attention was something more subtle and quality that was difficult to define but impossible to ignore. She moved through the space like water finding its natural level, adapting to the environment without changing her essential nature or compromising her position. Her boots made almost no sound as she crossed the concrete floor, a detail that registered unconsciously with men trained to notice such things. Most people, especially in a military environment, announced their presence through the sound of their movement, the deliberate stomp of authority, the hurried pace of urgency, or the casual shuffle of someone comfortable in familiar territory. Casey's movement pattern suggested none of these things. Instead, she moved like someone accustomed to environments where noise discipline could mean the difference between mission, success, and catastrophic failure. She carried a Pozla standard issue gear bag slung over her shoulder, but the way she handled it indicated familiarity with equipment that went far beyond basic training. Her hands, visible as she adjusted the bag's position, showed the subtle callousing and small scars that came from extensive work with ropes, weapons, and the kind of specialized tools that most military personnel never saw outside of classified briefings. These weren't the soft hands of someone who spent their career behind a desk or in administrative roles. As she surveyed the training facility, her eyes moved with the kind of systematic precision that suggested advanced tactical training. She wasn't just looking around casually, she was conducting what appeared to be a threat assessment, identifying entry and exit points, noting the positions of potential cover, and cataloging the disposition of personnel in the space. It was the kind of automatic behavior that became second nature to people who'd operated in environments where situational awareness wasn't just important, it was survival. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across her face, revealing features that suggested mixed heritage, possibly Hispanic and European, though her appearance was distinctive enough that racial categorization seemed irrelevant. What mattered more was the expression she wore, or rather, the careful absence of expression. Her face revealed nothing about her thoughts, intentions, or emotional state. It was the kind of professional neutrality that took years to develop and indicated someone accustomed to operating in situations where showing weakness or uncertainty could have fatal consequences. Uniform bore the standard name tape and rank insignia, appropriate for a Navy lieutenant, but something about the way she wore them suggested these were recent additions rather than long-held identifiers. The fabric around the patches looked slightly newer than the rest of her uniform, and the positioning was precise enough to suggest someone who wasn't entirely comfortable with visible rank displays but understood their necessity in this environment. Casey's arrival hadn't been announced through normal channels, which was unusual for Naval Station Meridian Bay. Every personnel movement, especially involving commissioned officers, typically generated paperwork that preceded the individual by several days. Training schedules were coordinated weeks in advance, and temporary duty assignments required approval from multiple levels of command. Yet here she was, appearing without fanfare or explanation. As if she'd simply materialized from thin air, she selected an empty section of the facility near the far wall, away from Team Bravo's established territory but positioned where she could observe the entire training floor without appearing to do so. Her choice of location was tactically sound. It provided multiple escape routes, while offering clear sightlines to all potential threats. Most people would have chosen a spot based on comfort or convenience. Casey's positioning suggested someone who thought in terms of tactical advantages even during routine activities. As she began unpacking her gear bag, the contents that emerged were standard military equipment, tactical vest, helmet, various pouches and accessories, but everything showed the kind of wear patterns that indicated extensive field use rather than training exercises. The gear had been maintained meticulously, but it carried the subtle signs of having been tested under real-world conditions where equipment failure could result in mission compromise or personnel casualties. Her movements remained economical and purposeful as she prepared her equipment, each action flowing seamlessly into the next without wasted motion or unnecessary adjustments. Watching her work was like observing a master craftsman who'd performed these same actions thousands of times under circumstances ranging from routine to life-threatening. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. Just the smooth efficiency of someone whose muscle memory had been programmed by necessity rather than repetition. The first detail that caught Derek Bullseye Walsh's attention wasn't what Casey wore, but what she didn't wear. Her uniform looked regulation perfect from a distance, but closer inspection revealed several anomalies that didn't fit standard military protocols. Where her name tape should have displayed Reeves, there was instead a blank piece of matching fabric, cut and sewn with professional precision but completely devoid of identification. The thread work was so seamless, it appeared intentional rather than hastily removed, suggesting someone had taken considerable care to eliminate her identity markers. More intriguingly, her rank insignia seemed oddly positioned, sitting just slightly higher on her collar than regulation specified. It was a minuscule deviation that most people wouldn't notice, but to trained military personnel, it stood out like a beacon. The positioning suggested someone unaccustomed to wearing visible rank, perhaps because they typically operated under different protocols, where such identifiers were liability rather than necessity. The pins themselves appeared newer than the rest of her uniform, their metal surfaces lacking the subtle wear patterns that came from months of regular use. Her left shoulder bore the ghost outline of a unit patch that had been recently removed. The fabric showed the faint impression of what had once been there, rectangular in shape, approximately 3 inches wide, with the shadow pattern suggesting text and possibly a specialized insignia. Whatever organization she'd represented, someone had deemed it necessary to eliminate all traces of that affiliation before her arrival at Naval Station Meridian Bay. The removal had been done professionally, but fabric memory was difficult to eliminate completely, leaving behind traces visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Most telling was the complete absence of deployment ribbons, qualification badges, or any of the dozens of small decorations that accumulated on military uniforms over the course of a career. Even the most junior officers typically displayed basic qualification markers, warfare pins, training completion badges, unit citations that documented their military journey from recruit to commissioned officer. Casey's uniform was conspicuously clean of such identifiers, creating the impression of someone who'd either just entered service or whose actual service record couldn't be publicly displayed. Her boots told a different story entirely. While regulation black leather and properly maintained, they showed wear patterns that contradicted her apparently minimal service history. The soles displayed the kind of specialized erosion that came from movement across varied terrain, not just the standard wear of parade grounds and office buildings, but the distinctive patterns created by desert sand, mountain rocks, and urban debris. The leather bore subtle scarring from activities that went far beyond normal military duties, including what appeared to be rope burn marks near the ankles and small puncture marks that suggested encounter with thorned vegetation or wire obstacles. Around her neck hung standard dog tags, but they were positioned unusually high on her chest, almost hidden beneath her uniform collar. Most service members wore their identification tags at a comfortable length that allowed easy access while remaining visible as a symbol of their military status. Casey's tags were positioned as if she preferred people not to know they existed, another indication of someone unaccustomed to or uncomfortable with visible military identifiers. Her hands provided perhaps the most contradictory evidence of all. While her uniform suggested limited military experience, her hands told the story of someone who'd spent considerable time working with specialized equipment under challenging conditions. The callus patterns were wrong for standard military training, instead of the typical markings from rifle work and basic military tasks. She displayed the distinctive scarring associated with advanced climbing equipment, demolitions handling, and what appeared to be extensive knife work. These weren't the hands of a desk officer or even a conventional field operative, but someone whose job description included activities that left permanent physical evidence. Her wedding ring finger bore the telltale indentation of someone who normally wore a band but had removed it for this assignment. The mark was recent but deep, suggesting she'd worn the ring consistently for an extended period before taking it off. This detail raised questions about operational security protocols that might require the removal of personal identifiers that could compromise mission security or personal safety. Most military personnel kept their wedding rings on regardless of assignment, unless their duties specifically required the elimination of all personal connections. Even her hair, pulled back in a regulation bun, showed signs of recent professional attention that seemed inconsistent with standard military grooming. The cut was precise and expensive, the kind of styling typically associated with positions requiring public presentation or diplomatic functions rather than field operations. Yet the way she wore it suggested someone more comfortable with practical arrangements than aesthetic considerations, as if the professional styling was a recent requirement rather than personal preference. Her posture while preparing her equipment revealed training that went beyond conventional military instruction. She moved with the kind of body awareness that indicated extensive martial arts background, possibly including disciplines that weren't part of standard military training programs. Her balance was too perfect, her movements too economical, and her spatial awareness too acute for someone whose military experience matched what her uniform suggested. The gear bag she'd brought contained standard military equipment, but even these items showed signs of modification that wasn't typical for regular issue materials. Straps had been repositioned, pockets had been added or relocated, and various pieces of equipment bore the kind of customization that came from extensive field experience where standard configurations proved inadequate for operational requirements. These modifications weren't amateur improvements, but professional alterations that suggested access to specialized technical support. Most puzzling was the medical bracelet partially visible beneath her left sleeve, not the standard military medical alert tags that documented allergies or blood type, but something more sophisticated that appeared to contain electronic components. Whatever information it carried was clearly considered more important than standard medical data, raising questions about the kind of activities that might require such specialized medical monitoring. The atmosphere in Building C shifted with the subtle awareness that elite operators developed after years of combat experience. It wasn't anything dramatic or obvious. Conversations didn't stop, training didn't pause, and the normal rhythm of military activity continued unchanged. But there was a new undercurrent of attention, the kind of heightened awareness that occurred when something unexpected entered a familiar environment. Ryan Hawk Thompson was the first to notice her, his peripheral vision catching the movement near the far wall as he adjusted his tactical vest. Years of staying alive in hostile territory had taught him to catalog every change in his surroundings, no matter how minor. His eyes flicked toward Casey's position, taking in the details with the systematic precision that had kept his team alive through 17 consecutive missions. What he saw didn't immediately concern him, but it triggered the kind of professional curiosity that came from encountering something that didn't quite fit established patterns. Derek, bullseye. Walsh caught the direction of Hawk's glance and followed it, his own training kicking in automatically. As a sniper, his survival had always depended on his ability to identify threats and anomalies at distance, often under conditions where a single misidentification could prove fatal. His eyes swept over Casey's position with the methodical thoroughness of someone accustomed to extracting maximum information from minimal visual cues. The absence of visible identification on her uniform registered immediately, filing away in his memory as something requiring further observation. Chief Petty Officer Mike Ironside Rodriguez noticed the change in his teammates' attention patterns before he spotted Casey herself. Years of working as a cohesive unit had taught him to read the subtle shifts in body language that indicated his brothers had identified something worth watching. When he finally located the source of their interest, his assessment was characteristically direct and practical. New personnel. Officer rank, unknown affiliation, position for tactical advantage rather than social interaction. The combination triggered his natural caution without raising immediate alarm. Other personnel in the training facility began to take notice as well, though their awareness manifested differently depending on their rank and experience level. Junior enlisted personnel glanced once and returned to their activities, recognizing officer rank and deferring appropriately without feeling the need for further investigation. Non-commissioned officers noted her presence with the professional acknowledgement they'd give any visiting officer, filing the information away for potential future reference, but not considering it immediately relevant to their duties. The more experienced operators in the facility, however, began to exhibit the kind of subtle behavioral changes that indicated heightened situational awareness. Conversations became slightly more subdued, not out of respect for rank, but from the unconscious recognition that something unusual was occurring. Equipment handling became more deliberate, movements more purposeful, as if everyone was unconsciously preparing for a situation that might require rapid response. Training. Instructor Staff Sergeant Paul Granite Morrison paused in his equipment inspection, his eyes settling on Casey's position for several seconds longer than casual observation would warrant. As someone responsible for facility security and training safety, he'd developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when normal routines were being disrupted. Her presence didn't represent a threat, but it introduced an unknown variable into an environment where predictability was often the difference between successful training and catastrophic accidents. The facility's civilian contractors, equipment maintenance personnel, and administrative support staff remained largely oblivious to the undercurrents of military awareness flowing through the space. They continued their work with the focused attention of people whose jobs required them to ignore most military activities unless directly involved. Their indifference provided an interesting counterpoint to the heightened awareness of the military personnel, highlighting just how attuned combat veterans became to changes in their operational environment. Even the facility's physical environment seemed to reflect the subtle shift in atmosphere. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast shadows differently as people adjusted their positions to maintain visual contact with the new arrival. The rhythm of equipment handling changed subtly as personnel became more conscious of the noise they were making, though none of them could have articulated why noise discipline suddenly seemed more important. Casey appeared completely unaware of the attention she was attracting, continuing her equipment preparation with the same methodical efficiency she displayed since entering the facility. Her body language suggested someone accustomed to operating under observation, comfortable with scrutiny, but not dependent on it for validation or direction. She moved through her tasks with the kind of professional focus that indicated extensive experience working in environments where distractions could prove fatal. The question that began forming in multiple minds simultaneously was why someone with her apparent qualifications was operating without standard military identification protocols. In an environment where security clearances, unit affiliations, and operational histories were matters of both professional pride and practical necessity, anonymity was almost unheard of. Officers at her rank typically carried extensive documentation of their training, qualifications, and assignment history, information that was routinely shared to establish credibility and operational compatibility. Her isolation in the facility began to take on additional significance as the minutes passed. Most visiting personnel, especially officers, would have reported to facility command upon arrival or at minimum established contact with their operational counterparts. Casey's apparent independence suggested either extraordinary autonomy or assignment to activities that operated outside normal military protocols. The training schedule posted on the facility's main bulletin Board made no mention of special operations, visiting personnel, or modifications to standard procedures. Whatever had brought Casey to Naval Station Meridian Bay, it hadn't been coordinated through normal channels or communicated to facility personnel through standard briefing procedures. This absence of official notification raised questions about the authority behind her presence and the nature of whatever mission had brought her there. As the facility's normal morning rhythm continued around her, Casey remained focused on her preparations, seemingly oblivious to the growing awareness of her presence among the veteran operators who shared the space. Commander James Titan Kelloway had earned his nickname through a combination of physical presence and an ego that seemed to expand with each successful mission under his command. Standing 6'4" with the kind of broad shoulders that filled doorways, he possessed the natural authority that came from being the biggest person in most rooms and the tactical acumen to back up his imposing presence. At 38, he'd spent the better part of 2 decades climbing the ranks of naval special operations, accumulating commendations and building a reputation that preceded him wherever elite military circles gathered. His service record read like a textbook example of career progression in special operations, multiple deployments across 3 different theaters, successful completion of every advanced training program the Navy offered, and a string of mission successes that had earned him the kind of respect usually reserved for legendary figures. Titan didn't just command operations. He dominated them through a combination of tactical brilliance and sheer force of personality that made subordinates eager to follow him into situations where lesser leaders would struggle to maintain unit cohesion. This morning had started like any other for Titan, with his customary survey of the training facility that served as his domain. He moved through Building C with the confident stride of someone who owned every square foot of the space, acknowledging subordinates with the kind of casual authority that reminded everyone exactly who was in charge. His uniform bore the crisp precision of someone who understood that appearance was often the first indicator of professional competence, and his bearing suggested a man comfortable with the weight of responsibility that came with his position. The sight of Casey preparing her equipment in relative isolation triggered something in Titan's personality that had served him well during his rise through the ranks, an instinctive need to establish and maintain hierarchical clarity in any situation involving unknown personnel. In his experience, unauthorized individuals in restricted military facilities usually represented either security breaches or administrative oversights, both of which required immediate attention from someone with the authority to resolve such issues definitively. His approach toward Casey's position was deliberate and public, designed as much to demonstrate command presence to the other personnel in the facility as to address whatever irregularity her presence represented. Titan had learned early in his career that leadership was often about being seen to lead, and his response to unexpected situations became opportunities to reinforce the chain of command and his position at its apex. The sound of his boots on the concrete floor carried with each step the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Without question, the timing of his approach was calculated with the precision that had made him successful in combat operations. He waited until several members of Team Bravo were positioned where they could observe the interaction, ensuring that his handling of the situation would be witnessed by personnel whose opinions carried weight throughout the special operations community. This wasn't just about addressing a potential security issue. It was about maintaining the kind of command presence that kept elite operators confident in their leadership during life-or-death situations. As he drew closer to Casey's position, Titan's assessment of the situation began to shift slightly. Her body language suggested someone completely comfortable in military environments, and her equipment preparation displayed the kind of professional competence that indicated extensive training. However, these observations only heightened his curiosity about why someone with apparent qualifications was operating without proper identification or coordination through normal command channels. His decision to directly confront the situation reflected the kind of decisive leadership style that had earned him rapid promotion through the ranks. Titan had built his reputation on his ability to take immediate action when circumstances demanded. Clarity, whether that involved tactical decisions during combat operations or administrative issues that threatened operational security. Hesitation and uncertainty were luxury items that elite military units couldn't afford, and his willingness to address problems directly had consistently proven effective throughout his career. The audience that had gathered, though not obviously, represented the kind of peer group whose respect Titan valued most highly. These were operators who'd proven themselves under the most demanding circumstances imaginable, and their opinion of his handling of unexpected situations would influence his standing within the broader special operations community. Their attention transformed a simple administrative inquiry into a demonstration of command capability that could enhance or diminish his reputation depending on the outcome. Titan's confidence in approaching the situation stemmed from years of experience dealing with similar irregularities. Throughout his career, he'd encountered numerous instances of personnel appearing in restricted areas without proper authorization. And these situations typically resolved themselves quickly once appropriate authority was applied. His standard approach, direct questioning backed by unmistakable command presence, had consistently proven effective in establishing facts and resolving discrepancies before they could develop into larger security issues at the facilities. Morning routine continued around them as Titan closed the distance to Casey's position. But the subtle shift in attention patterns indicated that this interaction was being observed by personnel throughout Building C. Training activities didn't pause, but the quality of attention changed as experienced operators recognized the potential for a significant incident developing before their eyes. These were people whose survival had often depended on their ability to read situational dynamics and the convergence of unknown personnel and command. Authority triggered their instinctive awareness of developing situations. "Lieutenant," he began, his tone professionally neutral, but carrying an unmistakable undertone of expectation. "I don't recall seeing any notification about visiting personnel scheduled for today's training." Rotation. His eyes swept over her equipment with the systematic precision of someone trained to extract maximum information from visual assessment. "Commander James Kelloway, Facility Training Coordinator. I'm going to need to see your orders and understand what brings you to my training facility." Casey's response was immediate and unsettling in its complete absence of the deference typically shown to superior officers. She didn't snap to attention, didn't interrupt her equipment preparation, and didn't display any of the reflexive respect protocols that military hierarchy demanded. Instead, she continued methodically checking her tactical vest, her movements unhurried and deliberate, as if Titan's presence and authority were factors of minimal importance to her current activities. "Training evolution," she replied without looking up from her gear, her voice carrying the kind of matter-of-fact tone typically reserved for routine administrative inquiries. "Need to validate some equipment modifications under live-fire conditions." Her hands continued working with practiced efficiency, adjusting straps and checking connections with the kind of muscle memory that came from extensive field experience. The casual dismissal of his authority hit Titan like a physical blow. Though years of professional discipline prevented any external reaction beyond a slight tightening around his eyes. In his experience, junior officers who failed to show appropriate respect either were operating under extraordinary circumstances that justified their behavior, or they represented disciplinary problems that required immediate correction. The possibility that Casey might fall into the first category was troubling enough to warrant cautious investigation. Before applying more direct command pressure, equipment modifications require written authorization through the base armorer. Titan continued, his voice maintaining professional control while carrying a subtle edge that indicated his patience was finite. Any live-fire training needs coordination through facility command to ensure range, safety, and avoid conflicts with scheduled operations. He shifted his weight slightly, a movement that emphasized his physical presence without appearing overtly threatening. Casey finally looked up from her equipment, her eyes meeting Titan's with the kind of steady regard that suggested someone completely unintimidated by his rank, position, or physical presence. Her expression remained neutral, but there was something in her gaze that hinted at depths of experience that might exceed his own. Despite the apparent disparity in their service records, based on visible rank indicators, authorization is handled through different channels for this particular equipment, she said, her tone remaining conversational despite the growing tension in the interaction. Range safety protocols are already in place through operational security measures you're not read into. She paused, allowing the implications of that statement to settle before continuing. Coordination requirements don't apply when operational necessity supersedes facility scheduling. The reference to security clearances and operational protocols beyond his knowledge struck at the heart of Titan's professional identity. Throughout his career, he'd prided himself on being included in the highest levels of military planning and operational security. The suggestion that activities were occurring within his facility that operated outside his knowledge or authority represented a fundamental challenge to his understanding of his role and responsibilities. Lieutenant, I'm going to need you to clarify exactly what authority you're operating under, Titan said, his voice beginning to carry the kind of edge that indicated his professional patience was approaching its limits. This facility operates under specific security protocols, and any activities conducted here require coordination through established command channels. His posture shifted subtly, becoming more rigid as his natural authority instincts began to override his initial caution. That's an interesting question, Casey replied, finally standing to her full height and facing him directly. The movement was fluid and controlled, suggesting someone completely comfortable with confrontation, despite the significant disparity in their apparent military positions. What makes you think you have the clearance level to receive that information? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge thrown down at the intersection of military protocol and operational security. Around the training facility, the subtle awareness of other personnel began to crystallize into focused attention as experienced operators recognized the signs of a developing situation that might require their involvement. Conversations became more subdued, equipment handling more deliberate, as the professional instincts of elite warriors began to activate in response to rising tension. Titan's jaw tightened as the implications of her response began to register. The suggestion that his security clearance might be insufficient for information about activities occurring within his own facility represented not just professional disrespect, but a fundamental challenge to the chain of command structure that formed the backbone of military organization. His years of successful leadership had been built on the principle that authority properly exercised was authority properly respected. My clearance level and command authority are not subjects for debate by junior officers, he said, his voice beginning to carry the kind of steel that had proven effective in maintaining discipline during the most challenging circumstances. You're going to provide me with proper identification, written orders, and a complete briefing on whatever activities you're planning, or you're going to find yourself under escort to the base commander's office for a very uncomfortable conversation about military protocol. Casey's response came not in words but in action that would be replayed in the minds of everyone present for years to come. Without breaking eye contact with Titan, she reached into the cargo pocket of her BDU trousers and withdrew what appeared to be a standard military identification folder. The movement was deliberate and controlled, designed to communicate confidence rather than compliance with his demands. Her fingers opened the folder with practiced precision, holding it at an angle that allowed Titan to see its contents while keeping it positioned where other personnel couldn't observe the details. Whatever Titan saw in that identification folder transformed his entire demeanor in the span of a heartbeat. His rigid posture, maintained through years of command authority, seemed to collapse inward as his eyes widened with recognition of something that clearly exceeded his expectations. The color drained from his face so quickly that several observers initially thought he might be experiencing a medical emergency. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again without producing sound, as if his vocal cords had forgotten their basic function. He began, his voice barely above a whisper, then stopped abruptly as if completing the sentence might violate security protocols. He wasn't even certain he understood. His eyes moved from the identification back to Casey's face, then back to the folder, as if his brain was struggling to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about military hierarchy and operational authority. Casey allowed him several seconds to absorb whatever revelation the identification contained, before closing the folder with the same deliberate precision she'd used to open it. Now you understand why coordination through normal channels isn't applicable to the situation, she said, her voice maintaining the same conversational tone despite the dramatic shift in power dynamics that had just occurred. The question is whether you're going to continue making this unnecessarily complicated. The transformation in Titan's behavior was so complete that it seemed to alter the very atmosphere of Building C personnel throughout the facility began to recognize that whatever was happening exceeded normal military protocol. Disputes and had entered territory that none of them were equipped to understand or interpret. The subtle awareness that had been building since Casey's arrival crystallized into focused attention as experienced operators realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in military experience. I wasn't informed, Titan stammered, his legendary command presence evaporating as he struggled to adapt to circumstances that his years of leadership experience hadn't prepared him to handle. There was no notification through command channels about this level of operational activity. His hand moved unconsciously toward his uniform pocket, as if reaching for communication equipment to verify information that clearly exceeded his security clearance to possess. Notification isn't part of the protocol for activities at this classification level, Casey explained with the patience of someone accustomed to explaining complex operational security requirements to personnel operating outside their normal sphere of authority. Your facility was selected specifically because it provides the necessary training infrastructure without requiring the extensive briefing of local command structure. The implications of her statement began to register with Titan as he realized that his facility had been chosen not because of his capabilities or authorization, but specifically because the activities she represented operated at levels where his knowledge and approval were irrelevant. The realization struck at the core of his professional identity, challenging his understanding of his role within the broader military structure. What do you need from me?" Titan asked, his voice carrying the note of uncertainty that his subordinates had never heard before. The man who had built his reputation on decisive action and unwavering confidence was clearly operating in territory beyond his experience or training. His posture shifted from aggressive authority to defensive caution as he tried to navigate a situation where his normal leadership tools were not only ineffective but potentially counterproductive. "Nothing that interferes with normal facility operations," Casey replied, returning the identification folder to her cargo pocket with movements that suggested the conversation was approaching its conclusion. "Continue your standard training schedule. Maintain normal security protocols. Pretend this conversation never happened once I leave this facility." She paused, allowing her instructions to register fully before delivering her final directive. "And ensure that your personnel understand that curiosity about my activities isn't healthy for their security clearances." The warning carried implications that extended far beyond simple military discipline. In the world of classified operations, unauthorized knowledge could result in career termination, security violations that followed personnel for the remainder of their lives, and in extreme cases, criminal charges that carried substantial prison sentences. Casey's casual reference to these consequences suggested someone with the authority to invoke them without requiring approval from higher command levels. Titan nodded with the mechanical precision of someone whose training had finally provided guidance for an unprecedented situation. When faced with authority that exceeded his comprehension, military protocol dictated compliance and discretion rather than continued resistance. His years of successful leadership had been built on understanding when to assert authority, and authority and coaches of successful leadership when to recognize that others possessed authority that superseded his own. "Understood," he managed, though his voice carried the strain of someone whose worldview had just been fundamentally altered. "Normal operations, standard security, no discussion." His eyes moved briefly toward the other personnel in the facility, already calculating how to manage their curiosity and ensure that Casey's presence didn't generate the kind of speculation that could result in security violations. Casey's slight nod acknowledged his compliance without suggesting approval or disapproval of his handling of the situation. Her attention was already shifting back toward her equipment preparation, indicating that from her perspective, the interruption had been resolved and normal activities could resume. The training simulation that followed would have proceeded according to standard protocol, if not for a catastrophic equipment malfunction that transformed routine exercise into nightmare scenario. Casey had been assigned to participate in a hostage rescue simulation designed to test coordination between established teams and individual operators under high-stress conditions. The exercise called for her to play the role of a captured asset, requiring extraction from a simulated terrorist stronghold, with Team Bravo executing the rescue operation under live-fire conditions using specialized ammunition designed to provide realistic ballistic feedback without lethal consequences. Building C had been reconfigured to simulate an urban environment, with movable walls creating a maze of corridors and rooms that replicated the kind of complex architectural challenges that special operations teams encountered in real-world scenarios. Smoke machines filled strategic locations with realistic haze that reduced visibility, while strobe lights simulated the disorienting effects of flashbang grenades. Sound effects played through hidden speakers created an audio environment that included gunfire, explosions, and the chaos of urban combat, forcing participants to rely on tactical communication and situational awareness rather than normal sensory input. Casey had been positioned in the simulation's objective room, restrained with zip ties that allowed for quick release once the rescue team reached her position. Her role required her to remain passive during the initial phases of the exercise, providing intelligence about simulated terrorist positions and capabilities once Team Bravo established contact. The scenario was designed to test the team's ability to extract a valuable asset under combat conditions, while maintaining operational security and minimizing civilian casualties represented by cardboard targets positioned throughout the facility. Team Bravo began their approach using standard dynamic entry techniques, with Hawk coordinating overall tactical movement, while Bullseye provided overwatch from an elevated position designed to simulate sniper support. Ironside led the close quarters element that would execute the actual extraction once the facility had been cleared of simulated hostile forces. Their movement through the maze of corridors demonstrated the kind of professional coordination that had made them legendary within special operations circles. the equipment malfunction occurred during the critical moments of the rescue sequence, when split-second timing and absolute precision were essential for mission success. Commander Kelloway, participating in the exercise as an additional team member to evaluate Casey's performance under stress, was positioned to provide covering fire as Team Bravo breached the final corridor leading to the objective room. His weapon, loaded with specialized training ammunition that used compressed air to propel non-lethal projectiles, had been inspected and certified according to standard safety protocols. What happened next would be investigated for months by military safety officials and equipment manufacturers, attempting to understand how multiple safety systems could fail simultaneously. The weapon's pressure regulation system malfunctioned. At the precise moment, Kelloway squeezed the trigger, causing the compressed air chamber to rupture and release its entire contents in a single devastating discharge. Instead of the controlled projectile designed for training purposes, the malfunction created a projectile with kinetic energy equivalent to live ammunition. The round struck Casey in her upper left thigh with the force of a high-velocity rifle bullet, the impact throwing her against the concrete wall with enough violence to crack the reinforcement behind the simulated terrorist stronghold facade. Blood began pooling beneath her leg immediately, the crimson spreading across the gray concrete floor with the rapid flow that indicated major vascular damage. The sound of the impact echoed through Building C with a wet finality that every combat veteran recognized as the sound of flesh yielding to metal traveling at lethal velocity. Kelloway's weapon clattered to the floor as the magnitude of what had occurred registered in his consciousness. The exercise parameters had called for simulated casualties and extraction under fire, but the blood spreading beneath Casey's motionless form was absolutely real. His training kicked in automatically, calling for immediate medical intervention and exercise termination, but the protocols seemed inadequate for addressing the reality of what his equipment malfunction had created. The rest of Team Bravo reacted with the kind of instantaneous coordination that separated elite operators from conventional military personnel. Hawk immediately established communication with facility medical personnel while maintaining tactical awareness of the ongoing exercise that had suddenly become a genuine emergency. Bullseye abandoned his overwatch position to provide direct medical assistance, his sniper training having included advanced battlefield medicine for situations where wounded teammates required immediate intervention. Ironside moved to establish a security perimeter around Casey's position, his tactical mind automatically processing the implications of a genuine casualty during what should have been a routine training evolution. His hands reached for medical supplies while his eyes swept the facility for potential threats, unable to completely abandon the tactical mindset that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments. Casey lay motionless on the concrete floor, her breathing controlled despite the obvious agony radiating from her wounded thigh. Blood continued to spread beneath her leg, creating a crimson lake that reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting of Building C. Her eyes remained open, fixed on some point beyond the ceiling, as if she was processing information that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of her injury. The silence that followed the gunshot was profound and unnatural, broken only by the distant hum of ventilation systems and the sound of approaching emergency personnel whose response had been triggered by automated sensors, detecting genuine ballistic discharge within the facility. What happened in the 47 seconds following Casey's injury would become the subject of classified after-action reports, psychological evaluations, and tactical doctrine revisions that would influence special operations training for decades to come. The transformation that occurred in her demeanor wasn't gradual or subtle. It was immediate, complete, and terrifying in its intensity. The woman who had been lying motionless on the concrete floor, blood pooling beneath her wounded thigh, suddenly moved with a fluidity that defied both physics and medical understanding. Casey's eyes, which had been staring at some distant point beyond the ceiling, snapped into focus with the predatory intensity of an apex predator identifying prey. The change wasn't just alertness returning to someone recovering from shock. It was something fundamental shifting inside her, as if pain had activated systems that normally remain dormant. Her breathing pattern changed from the shallow gasps of someone managing trauma to the controlled rhythm of someone preparing for violence. The zip ties that had been restraining her hands, designed to simulate captivity during the exercise, snapped, with a sharp crack that echoed off the concrete walls. No one saw exactly how she broke them. The movement was too fast, too economical, suggesting techniques that went far beyond standard escape and evasion training. Her hands were suddenly free, and the broken plastic restraints fell to the floor like discarded thoughts. Her movement from prone to standing occurred in a single flowing motion that seemed to ignore the gaping wound in her thigh and the blood that continued to stream down her leg. Physics suggested that someone with her level of injury should be incapacitated, possibly unconscious from blood loss and shock. Instead, Casey rose to her feet with the kind of controlled power that indicated not just functional capability, but enhanced operational capacity driven by something that transcended normal human limitations. Team Bravo found themselves facing a version of Casey that bore no resemblance to the quietly professional officer who had prepared her equipment that morning. Her posture radiated lethal intent, her movements carried the promise of violence, and her eyes held the kind of cold fury that experienced operators recognized as the precursor to actions that would haunt survivors for the remainder of their lives. This wasn't anger in any conventional sense. It was something more primal, more dangerous, and infinitely more focused. Bullseye, approaching with medical supplies and battlefield first aid training, stopped mid-stride as Casey's gaze fixed on him with predatory assessment. His sniper instincts, honed through dozens of combat deployments, screamed warnings about immediate threat detection and the need for defensive positioning. The wounded woman bleeding on the concrete floor had been replaced by something that his combat experience identified as exponentially more dangerous than any enemy he'd encountered in conventional warfare. Ironside's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, a reflexive response to threat indicators that his subconscious mind was processing faster than rational thought could analyze. His close-quarters combat experience had taught him to trust those instincts when facing opponents whose capabilities exceeded normal parameters. Whatever Casey had become in the moments following her injury, his tactical assessment categorized her as a threat requiring immediate response protocols. Hawk found himself caught between command responsibility and survival instinct as Casey's attention swept across Team Bravo with the systematic evaluation of someone conducting target acquisition. His leadership experience had never prepared him for situations where wounded friendly personnel transformed into potential hostile contacts, and his tactical training provided no protocols for managing teammates whose injury had apparently activated capabilities that exceeded their previous operational parameters. Commander Kelloway, still processing the horror of his equipment malfunction and its consequences, watched in fascination and terror as the woman he'd accidentally shot began moving with capabilities that contradicted everything he understood about human physiology and trauma response. Blood continued to flow from her thigh wound, but she showed no signs of weakness, pain, or limitation. If anything, she seemed to be growing stronger, more focused, more dangerous with each passing second. The facility's emergency medical personnel, responding to automated alerts about genuine ballistic discharge, arrived to find a situation that their training hadn't prepared them to handle. Instead of a wounded operator requiring immediate evacuation, they encountered someone whose injury appeared to have activated rather than incapacitated her operational capabilities. Her vital signs, visible to anyone with medical training, indicated someone operating at peak physical performance despite obvious trauma. Casey's voice, when she finally spoke, carried a tone that made experienced warriors unconsciously check their equipment and assess escape routes. "Interesting," she said, her words cutting through the silence with surgical precision. "It's been a while since someone actually managed to wound me during a training exercise." Her eyes moved systematically across each member of Team Bravo, cataloging strengths, weaknesses, and tactical vulnerabilities with the kind of professional assessment that suggested extensive experience in close quarters. Elimination techniques. The blood trail beneath her feet should have indicated someone requiring immediate medical evacuation and surgical intervention. Instead, it seemed to mark the path of someone whose injury had activated capabilities that existed far beyond normal special operations parameters. Her wound continued bleeding, but her movement pattern suggested someone for whom pain had become fuel rather than limitation. Someone whose injury had awakened rather than diminished her operational effectiveness. The realization began dawning on everyone present that they were witnessing something unprecedented in military experience. Someone whose combat capabilities increased rather than decreased under physical trauma. Someone for whom injury served as enhancement rather than impediment. The implications of this revelation would fundamentally alter their understanding of what was possible in human performance under extreme stress. The silence that followed Casey's transformation stretched across Building C like a held breath, broken only by the steady drip of blood from her wounded thigh hitting the concrete floor with metronomic precision. What had begun as a routine training exercise had evolved into something that would be classified at levels requiring presidential authorization to discuss, and the men of Team Bravo found themselves witnesses to capabilities that existed. Theoretical military doctrine, but had never been observed in actual operational conditions. Casey's next words carried the weight of revelation that would fundamentally alter everything. These elite operators thought they understood about the limits of human performance under combat stress. "My designation isn't actually lieutenant," she said, her voice maintaining the same conversational tone, despite the blood loss that should have rendered her unconscious. "That identification was necessary for operational security during my evaluation of this facility's training protocols." Commander Kelloway, still processing the horror of his equipment malfunction and its unintended consequences, found his voice first among the stunned personnel. What are you?" he asked, though the question emerged as barely more than a whisper. His years of commanding elite operations had exposed him to classified programs and experimental capabilities, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for witnessing someone whose combat effectiveness increased rather than decreased under physical trauma. "Project Lazarus," Casey replied, allowing the designation to settle in the minds of men whose security clearances had never provided access to information about programs that operated beyond conventional military oversight. "Biomedical enhancement. Protocols designed to create operators whose capabilities improve under combat stress rather than degrade. Pain isn't limitation for someone like me. It's activation of secondary operational systems." The implications of her revelation began cascading through the consciousness of everyone present like dominoes falling in predetermined sequence. Bullseye sniper training had taught him to observe and catalog details that others missed, and his assessment of Casey's current physical state contradicted everything medical science understood about trauma response. Her wound continued bleeding, but her muscle tone remained optimal, her breathing stayed controlled, and her movement patterns suggested someone operating at peak efficiency rather than someone managing life-threatening injury. Ironside's close-quarters combat experience had exposed him to opponents whose pain tolerance exceeded normal parameters, but Casey's capabilities went far beyond enhanced tolerance. Her injury appeared to have activated physiological responses that transformed trauma into tactical advantage, converting what should have been debilitating damage into operational enhancement. The bleeding wound in her thigh seemed to fuel rather than drain her physical capabilities. The biomedical modifications respond to combat stress by releasing enhanced neurochemical cocktails that override normal pain responses while amplifying strength, speed, and tactical processing capabilities, Casey explained with the clinical detachment of someone describing equipment specifications, rather than her own physiological enhancements. Injury triggers secondary activation. Protocols that can sustain peak performance for extended periods regardless of accumulated damage. Hawk's leadership experience had taught him to process complex information quickly during crisis situations. But the data Casey was providing challenged fundamental assumptions about human limitations that formed the basis of all tactical planning and operational doctrine. If personnel could be enhanced to perform better when wounded rather than worse, every aspect of special operations training and deployment would require complete revision. How many others? Titan asked, his command authority finally reasserting itself as the military implications of Casey's capabilities began to register. How many operators have undergone these modifications? The question carried weight beyond curiosity. If enhanced personnel were operating within special operations communities, their existence would affect everything from mission planning to casualty evacuation protocols. That information exceeds your security clearance, Casey replied. But her tone suggested the number was significant enough to represent a fundamental shift in special operations capabilities rather than isolated experimental subjects. What matters for your facility is understanding that normal training parameters don't apply to personnel operating under enhancement protocols. The blood loss that should have incapacitated Casey by now seemed to have stabilized, as if her modified physiology had adapted to manage trauma in ways that conventional medical understanding couldn't explain. Her wound continued bleeding, but the flow had decreased to levels suggesting enhanced clotting capabilities or circulatory modifications that maintained operational effectiveness despite vascular damage. Team Bravo found themselves recalibrating their understanding of what constituted elite performance as they observed someone whose injury had elevated rather than diminished her capabilities. Their own training had pushed human performance to extremes, but Casey's enhancements suggested possibilities that existed beyond natural limitations and into territory that redefined what was achievable through biomedical intervention. The exercise continues, Casey announced, her voice carrying authority that transcended rank structure and operational hierarchy. Your performance will be evaluated based on your ability to adapt to enhanced personnel capabilities rather than conventional operational parameters. Her eyes swept across Team Bravo with predatory assessment that suggested their real test was just beginning. The facility's medical personnel, trained to respond to combat injuries with immediate evacuation and surgical intervention, found themselves observing someone whose wound had apparently activated rather than incapacitated her operational capabilities. Their protocols provided no guidance for managing personnel whose injuries enhanced rather than diminished their combat effectiveness. As Casey began moving toward the facility's advanced training areas with fluid grace that ignored her wounded thigh, the men who had witnessed her transformation understood that they had been exposed to capabilities that would forever alter their understanding of what was possible in human performance under extreme stress. The blood trail she left behind marked not just her path through Building C, but the boundary between conventional special operations and something entirely new. The lesson was complete, though none of them would ever be authorized to discuss what they had learned. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.